Hi, DF crew. Hope you have all had a great week! Exclamation point. Could have been better. I was thinking recently that it may be useful for some if PC versions of multiplayer games had a quote-unquote console settings options within the graphics menu, likely based on PS5 settings. This would almost be a developer-optimized setting in effect, and beyond maybe resolution adjustments, provides an easy one-click solution to achieve the best balance of visual and performance. Beyond the obvious plus for yourselves when it comes to analysis, do you think this would be a welcome addition for gamers? So, Alex, this is a really timely question, bearing in mind some of the discussions we had this week, because we saw a tweet. I'm not sure it actually bore out with actual benchmarking, but it was a screenshot of Assassin's Creed at 1080p with quality level upscalings maxed, running at like 70 FPS on a 5090. And, obviously that's shocking. That's outrageous. I'm not sure it actually bore out compared to actual benchmarks from reputable benchmark people like Computer Base, who seem to be getting the same result at native 4K. But this particular thing is the point being made by Peter here is actually a really good idea and something that we've been pressing for some time. And it's something which people need to understand that ultra is ultra. It's like the whole idea of ultra settings is to take the existing systems within a game and push them to their theoretical limits, just to, in essence, provide future-proofing support for the PC hardware of tomorrow. That should be the rationale between what ultra setting is. So the concept that users should be dialing up everything to ultra on today's hardware, it's here be Dragon's territory. You shouldn't be expecting to get outstanding performance. The name itself is telling you that this is, ultra level stuff, and maybe you don't have an ultra level PC. Chances are you won't. Now, what Peter's suggesting here is a preset in the graphics menu that has console settings, and he's word for word explained our approach to optimize settings. Let's just describe how he said it again. A developer optimized settings and beyond resolution adjustments provides an easy one-click solution to achieve the best balance of visuals and performance. And developers do this for every single game they put out, because you can't run at ultra settings for the most part on a console. That's not what they're built for. You're designing a game primarily, I guess, for those consoles to run well on those consoles. Therefore, you make trades, and those trades, by and large, translate one-to-one to PC. Another point that Peter's saying here, for multiplayer games, I guess that there is some sort of rationale for multiplayer games, both in terms of, fairness, same level of visual experience, but it doesn't just apply to multiplayer games. The concept of optimized settings, which is console settings for the most part, applies to single player just as well.
Yeah. So there are limits to optimized settings in the aspect of if you have transformative technologies on the table, you would potentially avoid them. If you have like large architectural differences, you could go for other things in general. Like you could, instead of like a console version may boost shadow map quality or something like that. But maybe if you had a really good PC GPU, you would just keep shadow map quality more middling and instead use like a transformative technology, right? Like reflections, like RT reflections or something like that. So there are obviously nuances there, but taking those away, the developer came up with things that look good enough on generally hardware that is equivalent in a lot of ways to the lower spec PC parts that we see being so popular on Steam. And I think it would do them a great benefit to label those options as such in the game so that people don't feel like they're missing out on anything. And I think this FOMO thing, this my PC is good enough for ultra thing, there's a lot of historical reasons for it. But I think if people knew ahead of time that medium was the standard setting that is used on consoles, then I think it would save a lot of people that headache from, they shouldn't throw it up to ultra, but from throwing it up to ultra, because they would understand better that those settings are not standard. And the reasons why I think people do this in general is just a lack of knowledge. But I think people even who are knowledgeable maybe grew up during the time when PC gaming was like tail end Xbox 360 to that like Xbox One PS4 territory, where tail end of Xbox 360 PCs were really running circles around those consoles, GPU and CPU wise. So the games would come out with ultra settings, but they were all designed around these consoles, and those ultra settings wouldn't scale too high anyway. So they'd be running stuff like 1080p 60, 1440p 60 at a time when it was 720p, maybe 30 on the consoles. But then you get to later on, and I think that kind of persisted for a bit because the PS4 and Xbox One, GPU wise, PS4 is pretty okay when it comes out, but like the CPU situation was way different. And I think people maybe who grow up during that time period are used to Ultra being not so meaningful and also mainly meant to run on a Jaguar CPU. So they come to this current generation of games which scale way higher than they did in the past like 15, 20 years almost. And they're just like slapped in the face when they turn things up. And I think so there's like two ways you can come at it, but I think the developers can really help people out by giving us console equivalent settings.
Yeah, I agree. Oliver?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly would appreciate console equivalent settings in some cases. For our work, it certainly is quite helpful. And I think in general, it's very helpful to understand what the kind of standardized experience is meant to be from the development side. And that does, oftentimes dialing in the medium preset or the high preset gets you most of the way there in terms of getting down to like the developer intended optimized settings. But in this case, this would basically be a way to shortcut that process. But I do think developers have good reason often to want to obscure to some extent their settings on console, because oftentimes it doesn't make the console look so flattering if, for instance, in Control, they're mostly running with like the low settings preset, right? Even though ultimately the name of a preset is really just a name that implies some kind of relative positioning, but it doesn't imply absolute resolution figures or absolute positioning in terms of features or anything like that. So that's certainly an issue there potentially for developers and for advertising games. But I think the area in which I think this is most interesting potentially is actually in multiplayer games, where there is a reason to homogenize features and homogenize settings across platforms for gameplay reasons. That's actually usually where you see some of this emerge in a more profound and more significant way in titles like Call of Duty Warzone, for instance, where they need to homogenize settings, for instance, for foliage across platforms so players can't get an undue advantage by lowering settings to a certain degree or increasing settings to a certain degree. That's actually where I see this coming in a more real way for PC players.
Yeah. I mean, what can I say? There's this perception of what actually is an optimized game, which is kind of bizarre. Kingdom Come Deliverance obviously was mooted as being a game that ran really well, but it's a game, I think so. That was the case because a lot of people were running it at ultra and getting a good experience, when in actual fact, is the concept of what ultra is between one game and the next varies dramatically. Then you had the situation with the Ubisoft massive games, Outlaws and Star Wars Outlaws and Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, where they were worried that people would just ramp everything up to the max. So you actually have to use a launch switch in order to actually unlock what are actually ultra settings, which is an easy way to sort of circumvent that. I think the concept of providing those console equivalent settings is actually a good one, because, ultimately the current generation of consoles are PCs, it's that AMD PCs. There are going to be sort of instances where, what do you do about upscaling? Avatar, for example, can go as low as 720p on its performance mode, which is sort of kind of optimal, but kind of not. So it's definitely a case where I think users need to be aware that, there is no sort of, typically it's not the case that, consoles are always on medium or always on high. Each system is going to have a different optimal position. I think that's not really represented by the concept of having presets that kind of force you to high or medium or ultra. It's tricky, but I honestly think that, just a default selection that is the console selection is probably a good way forward. And the idea that ultra comes with a here be dragons warning, we've designed this for the hardware of tomorrow. At least people will be aware. It will make them think twice before just ramping everything up to ultra and expecting a super optimal experience. I think it's an area where there can definitely be more transparency and better implementations, I think.